discussion. So first, I would like to introduce Julie Huss from the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, who is the session chair for the first subsession. The floor is yours, Julie.
Thank you very much. So today, the first session, we're going to be looking at some policy perspectives on the climate change. We want to kind of find out what is being requested from policymakers. We have 3 presentations. We're going to keep each presentation to no more than 12 to 15 minutes. That means we are cutting this session by 15 minutes so that we can give some additional time to session 3B, which is really packed. So I hope we can do this appropriately. I plan to we've got 3 different perspectives. We've got the OECD, then we have SCAP and disaster-related statistics, and then we have the UNECE talking about what our role as national statisticians can be in this picture. So let's go ahead and start. We have an online presentation first from the OECD. If you can help us, thank you. Is this Michaela?
Yes, good morning. So can I go and share my screen? Okay, thank you very much. I'll share my screen. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having us today. So my name is Michaela Rembarli, and I'm part of the Environment Directorate, where I work on measuring progress on implementing national adaptation policies. So in this context, the starting point for us has really been the large adoption of adaptation policies across OECD countries. So these have sometimes been national adaptation policies, but also sectoral and local adaptation policies. Here, the different colors you see represent the different iteration of national adaptation plans, as well as the type of documents that were submitted by the countries. There is a growing need now that we have more than a decade of experience with adaptation policies to understand whether the objectives and the policies that the countries are implemented are achieving the expected results. All countries have adopted include adaptation objectives to increase resilience in these plans. For example, here it's one that is quite broad, but it's illustrative of the objectives that are included in the NAPs. For example, reduce vulnerability and improve the adaptive capacity of ecologic, social, and economic systems against climate change. And the objectives are either and mostly defined qualitatively and rather than quantitatively, and usually represent, but not always, the key climate risks that are identified in the country. They can also be a bit more sector specific or cover a specific geographic area, or represent a type of action such as reducing household or water consumption or over extraction. What we find is that most of the objectives are not necessarily associated with baselines and time frame, which makes it difficult to measure progress. At the international level, there's also a strong recognition that there's a gap on understanding progress on adaptation, and the information that is collected at the national level will also be relevant for informing the progress towards the global goal on adaptation, which was adopted as part of the Paris Agreement in 2015 to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability to climate change. As a follow-up to this adoption of the goal, a 2-year work program known as the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program was launched to develop a framework to review progress and towards achieving the goals listed here. And the first milestone was achieved in December last year at the last climate conference, where sectoral priorities were defined notably for water, food and agriculture, health, ecosystem and biodiversity, and others, through which a list of targets were listed, and along with another 2-year work program specifically on indicators, to not only to identify and develop indicators, but also to try and potentially quantify the elements of these targets. So I listed here some of the targets that were adopted as part of the agreement in December, that are quite broad and cover these sectoral priorities, notably, for example, to reduce climate-induced water scarcity, to increase the resilience against climate-related health impacts, or to reduce the climate impacts on ecosystem and biodiversity. So as part of our work, we carried out a survey among our member countries and other partner economies to understand what was the state of play in measuring progress on adaptation, and there was a strong recognition of the challenges to measure adaptation, notably, and in understanding whether the actions that they are implementing are achieving the objective that they had set for themselves. Notably because it's difficult and there is uncertainty about how much the change that can be attributed to the effectiveness of certain specific action. It's also difficult to design a system that is able to aggregate the results across scales, contexts, sectors, given the complex interactions between the system and also the context specificity of climate change adaptation. And it's also, there is also another challenge, which is around the best way to collect relevant data in a context where there are limited resources. So on the policy side, there are more and more OECD countries that have adopted climate laws that not only stipulate the requirement to develop climate risk assessment on a regular basis, but also that requires efforts to measure progress on adaptation. So in this context, what are the countries measuring so far? Here you see the climate risk framework, where climate impacts are a factor of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Our survey showed that this information is included, but to very various extent, in climate risk assessments. 80% of the countries reported to have developed national or sectoral climate risk assessment, which are updated every 5 years. And countries are trying to fill the information gaps on the hazard side by improving observed hazard and projections using different climate mitigation scenarios. But then when it comes to vulnerability, the quality of information is not as good from countries. On the vulnerability, the definitions and the methodology varies from one country to another, and they usually rely on qualitative description of vulnerability. And there are also fewer countries that assess exposure of their people, assets, economies, and ecosystem to climate hazards. And this information comes from the monitoring reports of the countries. For example, the UK assessed that 10% of its hospitals are at a significant risk of flooding, or the Slovak Republic established that 16% of its population is at risk of extreme heat. And these are two countries that we looked into through case studies. And here, and this is really where the SEEA land, water, or ecosystem accounts would usefully support these assessments. On climate impacts, which is really key to understand to what extent the level of adaptation helps reduce climate impacts, so which are the losses that results in terms of fatality or ecosystem degradation or economic loss. This is really information that is key to create a baseline and understand how climate adaptation helps reduce these climate impacts. But the difficulty here that it's really around the difficulty of measuring and understanding the attribution between adaptation action and the results. And to overcome this, the countries on the adaptation policy side also try to fill the gaps by undertaking expert interviews, applying a theory of change method to understand how an input leads to the impact, or at a more project level to understand, carry out project impact assessment to understand what might be the outcomes from the policy. So countries on the policy side are also trying to measure the direct results of that policy. So, for example, the extent of protected area, the share of funding allocated to nature-based solutions. They're also trying to assess the financial and human resources engaged in adaptation, but this is usually not very comprehensive and might be at more project level rather than at the national level. On the resource engaged, and very relevant to this morning discussion, we are also organizing a dialogue tomorrow afternoon. So I've added here the link if you want to complement today's discussion on a workshop on better estimating public expenditure for adaptation. And you're all welcome to join as well. And finally, here I wanted to end my presentation by saying that as part of their adaptation measurement frameworks, countries that have also, the countries that have responded to our survey said that they really relied on indicators to measure progress, and they associate their own objectives to indicators. But however, in practice, what we see is that there is limited use of indicators because it's difficult to understand what is useful to measure for adaptation. And there are data availability and data ownership challenges to measure progress on adaptation. So here I'll pass the floor to Miguel to illustrate how the OECD is trying to fill these gaps.
Thank you, Michaela. So my name is Miguel Carona Rodriguez, and I work on the Environmental Performance and Information Division of the OECD. And I manage the OECD PINE database. You might have heard of this, the Policy Instruments for the Environment database. Please, next slide. So this is a database that has been at the OECD for about 20 years, and specifically the database collects information on policy instruments directed at several environmental domains. So we cover 5 types of policy instruments. These are deposit refund schemes, environmentally beneficial subsidies and payments, taxes and fees, travel permits and offsets, and voluntary approaches. At the moment, we cover about 135 countries. There are about 4,000 or more policy instruments. And we collect qualitative and quantitative information on these policy instruments, and we use this information to create indicators. So some of the indicators we create with this database is environmentally related tax revenue. So we collect information on tax revenue to produce tax revenue statistics by domain, also by category. And we also harmonize this and use the information and statistics to build accounts, environmentally related tax revenue accounts. You'll see that one of the environmental domains is climate change adaptation. It's relatively covered, let's say, in much lesser number of policy instruments compared to climate change mitigation and circular economy. And this is because of the scope of the database. Can we go to the next slide? So we have an approach to tag environmental domains in the PINE database, to tag each of these policy instruments. And given the scope of the database, these policy instruments for adaptation are quite low in number. The database scope is limited to instruments that incentivize environmentally beneficial products or activities, or disincentivize environmentally harmful products or activities. So importantly, the definition or the way to sort of categorize policy instruments is not about motivation, names, or descriptions, because these can vary across countries and do not necessarily reflect environmental considerations. So instead, we propose several definitions, and the idea, or with the PINE scope, the definition of climate change adaptation policy instruments sort of focuses on the subset of adaptation instruments that incentivize nature-based structural solutions. And these are to address climate-related impacts and risks. So some examples of these policy instruments will be sort of subsidies for riparian buffers, promotion to coastal wetlands, stormwater retention ponds, green spaces, afforestation. So you'll see that compared to the IPCC definition of climate change adaptation, all gray and engineered or structural adaptation solutions are excluded from PINE. This also includes, we're also excluding social and institutional measures, and this is because of the scope of the database. Next slide, please. So in regards to SEEA, well, the first thing to notice is that the definition of climate change adaptation goes beyond the current scope of SEEA. And in addition to this, there are several distinctions to be made between the motivation and technical nature of some of the policy instruments. So similar to the PRINE approach, so sort of international comparability of indicators and mutually exclusive categories could be clarified if one focuses on activities or products instead of functional classifications, but this could be inconsistent with current classifications like the COFOG. In addition, the technical nature of climate change adaptation policies could be difficult to identify. And this may be because they are not sufficiently specific or environmentally focused. Then in regards to taxes, what we have done is basically further disaggregate information at the project or policy-based level, and in order to calculate information that is relevant and is classified according to the SEEA. Finally, some detailed list on activities and products will be helpful for this. So I think
you have 2 minutes now.
And this is in fact perfect because we have the last slide, which is about forthcoming OECD work. So on the work that my colleague Michaela is doing, there is a paper on measurement progress on adaptation. Also case studies, some of them I think that are out, and some of them are forthcoming. And there will also be work that is deep diving into specific sectors, starting with adaptation in agriculture. With the PINE database, we're strengthening the thematic coverage. This is specifically for biodiversity, oceans, and chemicals. As part of some internal work of the OECD, we're integrating all the policy data collection activities in a common database infrastructure. So this will take some time, but the idea is to gather all the resources of the OECD in a common infrastructure that can be shared and can be just across OECD products. There's also an effort to expand beyond the economic instruments. Beyond the Environment Directorate, we're collaborating with the OECD Economics Department to build a framework for assessing and addressing adaptation needs and priorities. This will be forthcoming later this year, in my understanding. And there is also ongoing work to update the Rio markers, and this includes the adaptation marker. And this is led by the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, but we're in close collaboration and discussions with them. And this is all from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, OECD. I think you brought up a number of interesting points that we're also going to be talking later, having to do with the revision of the COFOG, and whether the SEEA can answer all questions related to climate adaptation, whether it makes sense to expand the SEEA to include other topics, or whether we need to keep SEEA and simply say we can answer this much of the question. And these are important things to think about. We'll take the other presentations first, and then we'll do some questions. So keep your questions, write them down so you remember them. Our next, the OECD also brought up the hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and climate impact, which we talked about in our World Cafe with Terrapong on Monday. And so I will now give the floor to him to continue the discussions on disaster change statistics. You've got 15 minutes, and I'll let you know when you have 2 minutes left. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Julie. I'll try to do it in 10. because I think we have a lot of things in common with what OECD already discussed. So I just straight away in the topic, why do we work on disaster-related statistics, and what is the DRSF, the framework? This work has started before we had the Sendai framework for DRR, and before we have the 2030 agenda for the sustainable development, because we foresee statistical issues in measuring disasters, in measuring damage and losses for statistical purposes, how to bring robustness in terms of the data into the policy discussion. We know exactly what needs to be measured from all the policy frameworks, national policy frameworks and the national policy frameworks. There are problems. Countries differ in disaster-related statistic practices depending on how well your system is organized compared to other countries who produce incoherent statistics. And many institutions are involved in collecting so-called disaster-related data. So data are fragmented across the system. And we see the role of statistical framework and in helping us shaping the answer, how do we meet all these information demands in a way that we could bring coherence to the statistics discussion and policy discussion that has to do with compiling data from multiple sources, from multiple government agencies that may or may not collect the data for statistical purposes. That's the main issue that we faced. And thanks to colleagues from OECD, I think we've seen all these components of what we would consider as the disaster-related statistics. It's maybe easier to organize them into different components and put them in a conceptual framework. One way of looking at this is divided into three main components. One is the left column, before emergency. So before bad thing happens, you already need a set of statistics for preparedness and prevention and planning. Those includes what kind of disaster we have, hazards that are common in your country and different parts of your country. What about the level of exposure that we heard from OECD, both in terms of demographic, social groups, in terms of physical assets, built assets, in terms of environment ecosystem. And we want to know how vulnerable they are, and if the country has a coping capacity if something bad happened. So that's a set of statistics that you would need in so-called in normal time, in peacetime, in the disaster community, they would call in peacetime, because you need that for risk-informed development, action, and planning. So one disaster happens, you need another set of information. So and that in line with we heard in the presentation on all kinds of impacts that we need to measure, both direct and indirect. In terms of the direct impact, we talk about human impacts, the fatality, affected, injured, evacuated, and we also talk about material impacts in terms of the damage and losses to either to the production, to the asset, to environment ecosystem. We also know that disaster have longer term consequences to countries' development. So what kind of measures that we could have in measuring indirect impacts? And underneath that, we want to understand what kind of investment government and private sector have, both before and after disaster, in terms of disaster prevention, preparedness, and also disaster response recovery. So that's why it's cut across before and after disaster. So that's kind of the components that we have. This was done through regional consultations and expert group, and went through discussion at the Statistical Commission, and these components constitute what we would consider as a basic range of disaster-related statistics. You will see the name of this basic range directly linked with the framework that we saw earlier. From this other occurrence, the basic statistics, background statistics on exposure to hazard, human impact, direct impact, both physical and monetary terms. One sector that is of policy importance is agriculture. So we have different basic range for that. Direct environmental impacts, and we call it in earlier days this DRR expenditure accounts. I think is maybe better framed as disaster related expenditure accounting. All of these components has their proposed table templates for compilation purposes. You can look at it as accounts, right? You have blank tables with suggested columns and rows, and then we would test that and hope that is going to be compiled consistently across countries. That's something that is missing in compared to the framework that we discussed. Indirect impact is not part of the basic range, mainly because we don't have the clear definition yet on how to measure them or how to define indirect disaster rather. There's a clear linkages between disaster-related statistics and the SEEA. If we look into the SEEA framework, organize it into the assets, physical flows, and monetary flows, right? In the asset accounts table, you already have one category called catastrophic loss as part of reduction in stock. The issue in that is bad thing that's happened doesn't need to be disasters, and we are trying to set up a framework that measures disasters, not something else. So we have to be able to say if something happened, is that accident, is that incident, is that disaster, is that hazard, is that just bad thing that's happened, like you lost your cat? it could be a disaster for you, but perhaps not for the system, for example. And this we'll talk about that a bit more if we have more time. Monetary flow is perhaps the area that we advance the most, partly because we have the satellite accounting approach, and SEEA has done that in the EPA and EGSS, so we know how to deal with it. The part that perhaps need a bit more thinking is the physical flow. Everything of disaster present shocks to the system. And that shocks disrupt supply and use of products. It increase wastes. It increase water emissions. It impact households in different ways. SEEA, in terms of the household, we have one big lump, right, as a final consumer. How can we think of the ways to say, in terms of income level, poor, medium, high household impact to disaster differently? What are people in urban rural area? What about their level of education? On the SEEA ecosystem is presented in terms of the changes to the assets that impact the changes also in the ecosystem services. So that's in terms of how we can link that to the SEEA. We have many issues that some of them are still remain to be solved. How do we define the scope of environment and ecosystem when we want to measure disaster impact? Treatment of changes to ecosystem services. So I don't need to read all of this, but there are many issues, particularly the third point to the last. How do we define disaster? We are all statisticians. We want to be able to count things, and we want to know what to put in which boxes. And if we put things in the wrong boxes, then we are counting totally differently, right? But we also, a lot of work has already begun to address them. So we have the DISF, as mentioned. ECA has a lot of work on recommendations on measuring hazardous events and disaster. Also have a good indicator framework. We have work done on the hazard information profiles. And as I mentioned, the Statistical Commission gave us a mandate in coming up with a global common framework for disaster reduction and disaster-related statistics, rather. We have started to work on issue papers around the three main areas of high policy interest on the economic laws, disaster expenditure accounting, environmental ecosystem laws. We started to think about how do we define disaster. What is this a disaster? What is this not a disaster? So that statistical community can help in counting things, right? So that's work is underway, and I think there's a lot for the community to offer and to contribute. And I think I'll leave there for everyone to think of how can we contribute from the SEEA community to the disaster reduction and statistics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like us to pick up a few words from here. You can see from both policy discussions or presentations we've seen so far, they're looking through the glasses of policy, which they often use the words impact. When we're looking at things, we've got another perspective that we've got policy. We're needing to look at main purpose and potentially secondary purpose. So please realize that we're trying to get information for the policymakers. They're using different language. I'm saying don't get sucked into using their language. They use it for a specific purpose, because that's what makes sense to them. We need to be sure that what we're doing makes sense to us in order to help answer their questions, okay? Let's move on then to the third presentation, which we have from the UNECE, and the topic is to look at our role as NSOs in achieving national climate objectives. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, to this distinguished group of experts today. My name is Gosia Ćwiek, and I'm responsible for the work on climate change-related statistics at the Statistical Division of UNECE. And today I will present the outcomes of the work on the role of national statistical offices in achieving national climate objectives that has been carried out by a dedicated task force over the last 2 years. And I present this work as the secretary of this group, but it's of course based on the work of many national and international experts that contributed to that group. And many of them are also present in this room. So thank you very much for your contribution as well. So just to start with a very brief background, the UNECE work on climate change-related statistics started more than 10 years ago. And throughout that time, the primary objective has always been to make official statistics more useful for climate change policy analysis and to promote the involvement of statistical offices with the greenhouse gas inventories and now more broadly with climate authorities. So to strengthen the role and the contribution that NSOs can bring to this topic. And the key milestones on that road have certainly been the SEEA's recommendations on this topic from 2014, and then the publication of the core set of indicators using SEEA in 2020. But now we are looking at the latest addition on this timeline, which of course builds on the previous work, and this is the new task force on the role of NSOs. And I thought it's important to say upfront, why did we need this task force after all the nice work that has been done over the years? And here, there are a couple of important reasons. So one reason is clear from this timeline that the previous overarching recommendations have been approved before the Paris Agreement was adopted and its work program. So there are definitely new circumstances to take into account, and there is a reason to reassess the role of statistical community in the new situation. Then the second reason is that actually the transparency is the bedrock of the Paris Agreement, and the scope of the reporting is now broader than it was before. However, this is not a classic indicator framework, and it's also the roles for NSOs are not prescribed, and it's a different role than what we know from, for example, the SDG framework. So as also Michaela and Miguel has mentioned, this is also an institutional setup that is still being built, like we've seen now the new developments related to the indicators on adaptation. So with this in mind, it is important to provide the information so that the national statistical offices can position themselves and play the role that is appropriate in their national circumstances. And then finally, what we've also observed in various situations is that actually, although a lot of data is already being produced by the statistical system that is relevant for climate change policy and analysis, sometimes and even more data could be produced by using the frameworks that we have. So often the climate change community does not really realize this, and sometimes they even ask for data that is already available, and often the domain experts working in the NSOs, perhaps not experts working on the SEEA, but in other domains, do not fully realize that their work is already important for this, for climate change topic. So we wanted to produce a guidance that will help to bridge this gap, and that also links to Julie's analogy with the glasses. So just to try to see the same thing through both sides and try to make that link a little bit easier. So the primary objective has been to develop the guidance on how NSOs can contribute to achieving climate objectives by identifying concrete ways in which NSOs can be involved and showcase what statistical system already offers. And the guidance was meant to inspire and support people working in the NSOs or those who want to start working or want to do more. We've had over 30 active members and many experts contributing ad hoc. Not going to go through this very long list, but it's really been a team effort there. And this work started in 2022. And we just a month ago got our draft guidance approved by the CS Bureau. So in a few days, it's going to be sent for broad consultation to all the CS countries and international organizations. So I hope it will also reach many of you. And then we'll be grateful for your feedback on the draft and your views. The primary audience of this discussion is the NSOs, as I said, but also we think that this document can be useful for data users to inform about what NSOs can offer in international organizations. And I would also like to emphasize that the point was not to develop new indicators or frameworks, but more to build on what is already available and showcase how NSOs can contribute, so make that link to policy applications, but also be very practical and include many examples. To describe the role of NSOs in achieving climate objectives, we've come up with these 10 chapters, so it's a lot of content, and I'm not gonna go through the details right now, but just to give you a kind of flavor. With the core, I would say the core chapters go from 3 to 8, and we start from the reporting under the Paris Agreement, because as I said, the institutional arrangements are not prescribed, and neither is the role of the NSO. So it's important to understand this landscape. Then we move to the national policy making, where high quality data is needed to design evidence-based policies and monitor their success. So we look at climate change mitigation, adaptation, but also just transition. So how to achieve and implement this mitigation adaptation actions in a way that is inclusive and doesn't leave anyone behind. We also look at the role of NSOs in informing the public, which is the core of NSO's mandate, because both the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda recognize that these global goals cannot be achieved without involving everyone, the private sector, the civil society, and the public. So to be empowered to take action, individuals also need to be informed, and we look at how NSOs can do it effectively. And then we also look at contribution of NSOs to meeting information needs related to the financial aspects. I'll go through that very quickly because of the time constraints. But for example, in the chapter on the institutional landscape and frameworks, we start from what is the primary role of NSOs, that this is the main part of the national statistical systems, and to produce official statistics on key topics for the economy and society, because this is the starting point of why NSOs have a role in climate change statistics. And then also we present the key frameworks and indicator sets that already exist, because this is part of the toolbox that NSOs have to address these information demands. We also look at various roles in the whole data value chain, because it's also important to note that in the climate change domain, there are many producers of climate change related data. The NSO is most often not the main player, and sometimes it can even find itself in the position of a data provider, if, for example, in the context of greenhouse gas inventories. And also, it's important to know that it is a very complex landscape with many stakeholders on international, national, local level. And also, we have to keep in mind academia, civil society, media, and private sector, because as I mentioned, they are important. This is another jump to a chapter on climate change adaptation, because that was also the topic of this session. And I'm not gonna go through this because luckily others have gone through it before me. But what we found important is that to provide relevant data for climate change adaptation, it's key to start from understanding the key terms of what we're trying to measure and understand the language of the policymakers and what information they're looking for. And it's also key to understand that data for climate change adaptation is not only data on climate change adaptation, which sometimes we fall into this trap that it's all about how many flood defenses are there, but it's actually about all the data that describe all these boxes that we have. So hazards, exposure, vulnerability, the risks and impacts. We also spoke about understanding the needs of the policymakers, and this is what we've tried to identify in all the chapters. And we try to pick up where those needs have already been articulated in some official documents, which are part of the climate change policy process. So as also OECD colleagues have mentioned, we have the process of national adaptation planning, which is ongoing in most countries. And interestingly, already in 2012, the technical guidelines for this national adaptation plan process highlighted the need to come up with data plans for NAP's M&E, and that the data should be collected and stored in a systematic manner, and the responsibility for compilation and aggregation of this data should be clearly assigned to one agency, which could be the NSO. And then 10 years later, we have the report from the UNECE Adaptation Committee in 2022, which was the contribution to the first global stocktake, that specifically mentions that gap, interestingly, in socioeconomic data, especially collocated with climate observations, are one of the key challenges in adaptation that can inhibit more accurate identification of risks. And it knows the potential opportunities for enhanced action, exploiting the potential of national statistical systems. So these kinds of information needs have already been articulated, and it's our role also to follow up on this and think how we can respond with what the statistical systems have to offer. So there are a number of roles that NSOs can play in the context of climate change adaptation, from identifying the role, coordinating with other organizations, of course, producing relevant statistics and indicators, many useful statistics and indicators based on SEEA, but also linking data, enabling producing subnational and geospatially enabled statistical data, sharing data and microdata for research and risk analysis, of course, within the existing legal frameworks, and playing a role in adaptation monitoring and evaluation, as has been requested also by the quotes I've referred to, but also promoting harmonization and international comparability through the use of existing classifications and indicators. And these roles, these functions are presented using examples collected from NSOs that were represented in the task force and linked to those policy questions. So now coming back to the big picture, after the deep dive in the adaptation, very quick one. So let me just reiterate that in all the areas that we have looked at, the NSOs have a very clear role to play. And also in each of these boxes, there is a role for SEEA. I have deliberately not gone into details because this is what this session is about, and the presenters will also give concrete examples later on. But this kind of overview, I believe it's helpful to show the big picture and also tell the whole story. And so the NSOs have a clear role in the reporting under the Paris Agreement, but at minimum, it is producing significant share of input data for greenhouse gas inventories. But there can be also more. But maybe also what needs to be highlighted is the role for climate change mitigation, which often is understood, especially by outsiders, as only limiting greenhouse gas emissions. But if we look at the data needs, then we can clearly see that we need data that can inform and monitor the actions needed to implement these objectives, and that also includes all kinds of enablers that are necessary. So, for example, available infrastructure, green jobs, critical raw materials, expenditure, as will be discussed later in the session, but also people's perceptions and behaviors. And then also adaptation, I've already spoke about, just transition, also some concrete examples. And I would like to just say a few more words about informing the public, because that's actually also important in the context of SEEA, where we have, because we based that chapter on interviews we've conducted with journalists, trying to understand what data they are using for writing their stories about climate change and what they are looking for and cannot find. And that was very interesting because from the SEEA world, especially sought after were carbon footprint estimates, but also it was very clear from our discussions that what journalists really need are very clear descriptions and explanations. And if something cannot be found easily, it will not be used because they do not have the time, and they also do not have an in-depth understanding of these methodologies. So sometimes they would say, oh, if it's the same trend, then we are fine with whatever methodology. But it's just a completely different mindset. And it's also important to know that sometimes people using our data are going to be under enormous time pressure. So they're just going to grab the first thing. If it's not immediately clear, the message will be lost. And then we also looked at financial aspects of climate action, which is in our work a relatively new area. So also the examples are much less mature, but there are also roles that NSOs can play there. And throughout all these areas, we've identified these 5 enablers that allow NSOs to play that role, and that covers governance and coordination, engagement with policymakers, strengthening data collection, local and geospatially enabled data, collaboration with researchers and academia. And the 6th cross-cutting issue is this relatively new area of measuring perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors, which actually relates to many of those policy goals and where NSOs can contribute, but it has been relatively unexplored until now. And based on that, we formulated some conclusions and recommendations. If I may just very briefly conclude that, as you can see, obviously, that the climate change it's a big societal issue. It's not only an environmental issue, so there is a clear role for NSOs to play. And it touches on many statistical domains. Many statistical frameworks and indicator sets are already in place. A lot of data is available, and also many innovative projects are happening. And we can also see that many of the innovations happening in the statistical offices will help to play even a bigger role in this domain. However, on the user side, we also see that an extensive system is being built around achieving climate goals. And at the moment, the statistical system is not very visible in that system, and it's not playing the same role as it does for other policy areas. So we need to really plug ourselves into those mechanisms to play the role that NSOs and the statistical system is prepared to play. And also an essential point to highlight is that no one is expecting the NSO to do everything. And it's all about collaboration, sharing the role, playing a role according to the institution's expertise, and making sure that the work that is already being done is visible and used. And the first overarching recommendation to achieve that is to get engaged with the climate community, to understand better the data needs, and for the climate change community to understand a bit better how statistical systems work. And the second overarching communication is to start with statistics and data that are already available, to build up a user community and start conversations on the relevance and use of data. And as one of the Bureau members said when they were discussing our draft, it's all about trying to get into the room with the policymakers to offer practical solutions to the questions they have rather than sitting alone and coming up with some statistics that could be potentially relevant. So we really need to make that step because there is already a lot that NSOs can offer. So with this, I thank you very much for the opportunity to present this work. I was a little bit quick, but I hope we made it through. And I just leave on the slides some links to our previous work and also to the collection of practices from the last 3 years. So you can find that on the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, you just made it under 15 minutes. I believe it was only myself and Estonia that were here. Were you involved, Short, in the first 2009? Yeah, so there were 3 of us, I think, still here now that were part of the first statistics related to climate change manual. Oh, and you. Sorry. Yes. Yeah, you were still Austria at that time. That's right. Oh, Qatar. Right. We all change hats. So, and the point is that things change, and the statistical community needs to stay up to date with what we're being asked to do. I would say that the SEEA accounts were already part of climate change discussions. At least we were in Norway when I was working in Norway back when I started in 1997. Our first SEEA accounts were air emission accounts, and we said, why aren't there? I was talking to the national accounts expert who was working with me, and he said, so where are the marine transport, the international transport shipping emissions from the IPCC Kyoto kind of agreement? And we said, well, I guess this is actually a political agreement, not a statistical setup. And so we realized that, at least in Norway, where shipping is a big industry, that we needed to get shipping, maritime shipping emissions included into the air emission accounts. They were, of course, at that time were not reported in the inventories that are reported. The national inventories are reported to the UNFCCC. So we were already seeing the importance of the SEEA and the SEEA accounts, and trying to make sure that our information matched the economic data that we're having. And then things have developed and developed. There's other policy questions that come up that we are needing to provide information, and that's climate related information is what we need now, and we need to continue to find good ways of finding it in our statistical system, and if it's not there, we need to develop it. In the United States, the challenge is that we have a decentralized statistical system, so that some folks are doing the physical accounts and information over here. We're doing there's a number of agencies involved in the economic data, and so I'm seeing that there's also a big coordination effort that needs to be done for the decentralized statistical systems. So with that, we've got about 5 minutes for questions from the audience. If folks have anything. Now I'll put my glasses on so I can see you. Okay, Estonia.
Julie, for reminding the 2009 event in Oslo first one on climate change and environmental accounting, we both actually were contributing to. And I remember that Peter Everett and Walter Rademacher were actually indicating that UNFCCC train is already running and it's going well. And with environmental accounts, we just have an opportunity to kind of try to redesign it a bit, but it's they are who are in charge. But in a way, it was right. I don't remember if you Julie remember that this discussion were on very kind of real in the conclusions. But after that, a lot of things have changed, and the links to socio-economical phenomena have become more and more important, and that's also the kind of the detailed information what we can be granular information we can provide regarding the climate change issues, mitigation aspects, roles of different economic sectors, and like you pointed out, connections to economy, how the residence principles are handled. So this is all become very important, and also the adaptation and issues which are already now quite up on our agenda. So really, I also during today's your talk. Even before you thought about this 2009 event in Oslo. So thank you for that. But in order to be short, I'm going to Terrapong and asking about disaster-related issues. And what do you, Terrapong, think? I know that in the reporting framework, you have expenditure figures. And how successful you are with expenditures related to disasters and disasters related to climate change, and do you plan to learn from statistical system and SEEA in sense of definitions, or to plan to kind of rely on the definitions of SEEA here? And what is the situation on this expenditure part? And I'm just asking from a response policies viewpoint, that as a response policies is something which is kind of a monopoly for the statistical system in a way, that is where we are really kind of good at expenditures, subsidies, monetary figures related to national accounts. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Terrapong, can you give a quick review on that? And are there any other questions? Let me see your flags. Thank you.
I guess there are many questions in the question. Right. Okay. So I can go now. Yeah. I just said that I think there are many questions in one question. I'll try to tackle them in terms of the disaster-related expenditures. We are in the business of making sure that things are working at the country level. So we learn from countries basically. For example, the country that I think make a lot of advances in this area is the Philippines, that they have annual production of their disaster expenditures, classified into disaster mitigation expenditures, disaster adaptation expenditure. And that would be the way we are heading, at least in terms of building one conceptual document that we can share with other countries in terms of how that would work in different statistical systems. So that's one. On disaster linking with climate change, the current thinking is try to solve that mystery through a good classification system. For instance, if you have a whole list of hazards comprehensively, out of that, how many of them are disasters? Out of that, how many of them are climate-induced disasters? So you wouldn't see that COVID-19 is climate-induced, for example. It could be, depending on how we define them, but the current thinking is to do it through a good classification system. I think that's another sub-question in there, but I'll stop here first because I think we are running out of time.
Good. I think that's the questions. Don't worry, you're not rid of me yet. I am going to present in the next session. So I'll keep my remarks for that session, and I appreciate everyone's sticking to a bit of a shorter time frame. I'll hand the meeting back to our big chief and let her decide when our coffee break is over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks for all the speakers for that really interesting session. And I also really liked your analogy with the classes, because also what was not mentioned, but I think it was there between the lines, was that we are the cooler community with the sunglasses.
Yeah.
So then we will break for coffee, and since we have so packed schedule today, we will try to keep it in 10 minutes. So let's be back at 20 to 11. Thank you.
Hey, Banumati, can you test your audio? No, I cannot hear you. So maybe it's better with the setting you had before. Hey, can I say something?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Leave it like this.
Yeah, I'll remove the headset.
Yeah. So for the interpreters, if the audio is not good enough, it's fully understandable. If you don't interpret, then we will have it in English only.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also have Rodrigo. Rodrigo, can you say a few words?
Hello, how are you?
Hi.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Perfect.
7.
Thank you. I can hear you well. Thank you. See you later.
See you. Hello, Banumati.
Hey, Rodrigo.
I don't know how to turn this on. Johanna, can you try to overrule me? Please take your seats.
Okay, so please take your seats so we can continue with our program because we have really interesting session in front of us and we want to, of course, make sure that everyone gets their time to speak and give their presentations. So we are moving on to our subsession 3B, which is climate change expenditures, and I will give the floor to our chair for this subsession, Niels Brown from Statistics Sweden.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and welcome to this session on climate change expenditures. I hope you agree with me that the earlier session did certainly establish a very interesting context for the presenters that we have now. And we have an excellent group of presenters, I think, all of whom share a common interest in these issues of using the SEEA to measure climate change expenditures. And I look forward to hearing more from all of them and to an active and engaged discussion. If I as a chair have any particular issues, I think it was very interesting to hear more about policy contexts that were mentioned in the previous presentations. So in your presentations, I maybe could ask you to really try to identify the policy context that you see and how those connect up to the particular measurement solutions that are proposed in respective presentations. So the first presenter that I have, who I believe is wearing somewhat two hats for this particular session. For the first presentation from SHERD, I will introduce the chair of the SEEA Central Framework Technical Committee, who is presenting on behalf of Ilaria Di Matteo for the United Nations Statistical Division on the Classification and Functions of Government. The floor is yours. I will let you know when you have 2 minutes left.
Thanks, Niels. Yes, indeed. I'm very glad to give this presentation on behalf of the UNSD. So this first presentation is, I would like to inform you of the revision of the classification of functions of government, better known as COFOG. And in particular, of course, I will go into what's the impact which is related to the compiling of the SEEA accounts. Well, I would like to start with a short introduction on COFOG. I will keep it short because I assume that most of you are very familiar with this. Well, the COFOG is part of a classification, a set of classifications on expenditure according to purpose, which also includes the classification of individual consumption by purpose, classification of purpose of non-profit institutions serving households, and the classification of outlays of producers by purpose. And I think to this set we can also now add the SEP classification because that's also a classification by purpose. The COFOG was approved by the United Nations Statistical Commission in 1990, so that's also quite some years ago. And it has not been updated or revised since. So in that regard, also a revision is quite due. And UNSD is the custodian of this classification. What are the main uses of COFOG? Well, in principle, of course, it has been developed to understand the structure of government expenditures, to support the system of national accounts and government finance statistics. In addition, it provides a wide range of statistics to support, to look at the expenditure by governments. And of course, particularly, of course, using the COFOG, you can identify what is our government spending their money on. And in addition, of course, you can also then compare different countries in that regard. So you can do all kind of in-country comparisons. It provides also all kinds of key aggregates and indicators that can also, of course, then also be used for all kinds of in-depth analysis. And well, of course, let's go back one. Of course, also a use of our COFOG data is, of course, for the compilation of our environmental accounts. It's a key data source that we use, for example, for the EPA, the ESST, and the MEA. So it's in that regard, it's very important for environmental accounting. Well, let's have a short look at the current structure of the COFOG. Here you see the main divisions, 10 in total, that address different issues, different topics, and included there is COFOG 05, which is about environmental protection, waste management, wastewater, etc., etc. So basically, this concurs with what was the old SEPA on environmental protection. And here also we see emerging one of the key issues that will be for the next revision, namely this COFOG 5 focuses on environmental protection, but resource management, as we have identified, is not part of it. That's more hidden away in the other divisions by COFOG. And also in that regard, of course, also climate mitigation measures, adaptation-related measures are also hidden in the other parts of the COFOG. So one of the possible issues that we would like to address is to make these issues more visible in the new revised COFOG structure. Well, in 2022, so 2 years ago, the United Nations Statistical Commission recommended to start a revision process for COFOG and to make an assessment whether also changes are required in other classifications on expenditure according to purpose. But well, of course, here I will focus on the COFOG revision. And since March 2022, several meetings have taken place. First of all, 2 meetings by the United Nations Committee of Experts of International Statistical Classifications. And there also was a first inception meeting for the revision of COFOG for stakeholder consultation. And basically, what was discussed at these meetings were in terms of reference of the task team, also the timeline for the revision. There was also an initial discussion of the topics that should be addressed, but it was also preliminary meetings. But important also is to recognize that, for example, in the October meeting, it was really emphasized that the importance of coordinating the update process with other macroeconomic standards, including the update of the government finance statistics that's going to take place, and of course also the update of the SEEA Center framework. So that's really also in view that that should be taken into account and to coordinate these efforts. Well, what are the main drivers of the revision that have been established based on this initial discussion? First of all, the COFOG revision key drivers, of course, that it has to meet new policy needs in this area, digitalization, education, but of course also very much environmental expenditures related to climate change, adaptation, biodiversity. I can also, of course, add circular economy here. So these are really the key driver of this revision. In addition to that, I can also think, also discussion we had already a bit yesterday, and I think we'll also continue here, is about the discussion on the secondary purpose expenditure. We have been talking about the primary purpose principle, and a lot of, and this is also one of the emerging issues, because often, for example, environment is a secondary purpose, as we have identified, and then it's hidden again in COFOG. And well, are there ways still to make this visible? Because from an environmental point of view, of course, it's very important to also, in such cases, look at the secondary purpose expenditure. Well, in addition, some other key drivers, of course, is to generate more granular data for more deeper analysis. Also to ensure that it is in line with updates of related frameworks and classifications, and also to provide more detailed compilation guidance in this regard. Well, this is more a general setup of the process for the revision. Of course, in the first stage, the task team will be established. They will set up an initial list of issues that will then go through global consultation, and then the issue list has to be finalized. Then the actual work, of course, has to start going through the issue list, which will end with a final draft, and that then will be submitted through the United Nations Committee of Experts on International Statistical Classification to the UNECE. Well, currently the task team for COFOG revision is being formed, and it's envisaged to bring together experts from classification, government finance statistics, national accounts, but also environmental accounts. Also the SEEA community will be involved there. And in addition, also some specialists from biodiversity, climate change, education, etc., etc. I will skip this one. Well, my final slides are on the timeline that we now have, that has been established. Well, this year, 2024, some initial meetings will take place by the task team that's being formed, followed by a global consultation of the list of issues later this year. Then, beginning of 2025, the list of issues will be finalized and the discussion will begin, which will continue in 2026, when the results will be presented to the UNECE for endorsement. And then the final step will be 2027 to submit the new revised COFOG classification to the UNECE. And hopefully we'll then have the revised COFOG classification that we can also use for our compilation of our environmental accounts. But of course, there's a note, there's a possible adjustment with regard to the update process. And of course, it's also good to see that, and basically this is going to be run parallel with the update process of the SEEA Center framework and also the update of the GFS. So in that regard, it's a nice parallel process. And a final slide is the proposed work plan for 2024, subject to further updates. Basically, the terms of references have been or are being finalized. The finalizing of the membership of the task team, and that will, of course, then have some first meeting to come up with an issue list. Some other meetings, and then in the second half of this year, there will be the global consultation on the issue list. And with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thanks.
Judd, just a note of order. I think we will aim to have all the presenters to present all at once, and then we will go to questions and discussions from delegates. So moving on from that presentation, I would like to welcome, joining us online, Rodrigo Pizarro from the OECD, who will present their work and proposal for the COFOG revision. Very welcome, Rodrigo. I will let you know when you have 2 minutes left of your 15 minutes to present. Rodrigo, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. It's a shame we cannot be there in person today. We very much look forward to these meetings. Believe that they are an essential part of our classification program of work. I will share a brief presentation I have. Hopefully you can see it now. And I wonder if it's in presentation mode. Could you please confirm that you are seeing it now?
Yes, it is in presentation mode, Rodrigo.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think my presentation will be very much complementary to what Sjoerd has just been saying. These are some of the concerns that have emerged with respect to the COFOG classification system. We have been discussing this internally for quite some time in the OECD, both in terms of the broad classification, the structure of the classification, but also how it relates to policy concerns. And therefore, we have been discussing a proposal which we've discussed partially with the international organization. We have a brief paper that's going to be presented in our Working Party on Environmental Information next week. And hopefully we will move ahead with developing a taxonomy. So let me just say some obvious things here, because it's important just to remind ourselves of what we're doing. So in the case of environmental and or climate expenditures, general environment, these refer in general to transfers or spending that the public sector carries aimed at environmental responses, specifically such as mitigation, but also things such as the management of climate-related disasters and risks. So there are a range of issues which do not fit easily with the current classification taxonomy, but also with how the COFOG is structured conceptually, and that's what I'd like to focus on. So identifying these expenditures is essential for governments for a number of reasons, and it's not only to assess the evolution of environmental policy or environmental policy concerns, but increasingly, particularly related to climate change expenditure, it's associated with fiscal risks from extraordinary expenditures. And this is an issue that will be, I think, at the core of Ministers of Finance concerns as we go ahead in the post-2030, the post-Paris Agreement world. So presently, governments classify their public expenditures through the COFOG, as has been presented. This is an international standard, which is not only relevant because it organizes public government expenditure, but is also very relevant because it connects to other classification systems. This is essential in order to connect classification systems across different policy domains. However, given the COFOG's limitations, governments are moving ahead. And I think this is very important for the statistical community to be aware. Given the limitations of the COFOG and its incapacity to respond to many of the questions that policymakers are generating, what we're seeing is an increasing use of environmental budget tagging as a way of resolving some of these problems. In a survey by the OECD in 2022, 2/3 of OECD countries had adopted some form of green budgeting. And this is an increase of around 60% from a previous 2021 survey. We see this across other countries. Currently, the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, is actively pursuing climate change tagging across Latin American countries, precisely because of the incapacity of the current classification systems to resolve. So let's just look a little bit in detail of why this is a problem. So the COFOG structure has 10 categories of protection, and it's further subdivided into these environmental functions. These environmental functions are not arbitrary. They're actually the principal environmental concerns in the 90s, and also with the focus of the way environmental policy management happened. Today, environmental policy has a quite different approach. It is much more cross-cutting, it's much more integral, and it deals with the way activities are implemented rather than a sort of an end-of-pipe solution, which is very much the focus of this structure. As many of you know, this subcategory classification maps onto old SEEA, which is no longer available, and therefore these we consider the classes of the groups. Now we have an immediate problem with this structure because the SEEA is not accepted, and therefore one question would be whether map onto the new classification of environmental purposes, or alternatively we will go into a new taxonomy. Now, what are the problems with the COFOG? And I think these issues have to be presented very, very quickly. So one clear problem is that the current taxonomy of what we call principal purpose concerns, which is the division 5, there are no clear groups or classes for new environmental issues, particularly climate change mitigation. The classifications around biodiversity are probably old. There is nothing economy. So there are a range of issues which are associated with the principal environmental concerns today, which are not well reflected by the current taxonomy or the categories within the environmental division. That alone would suggest the need for a reclassification. However, this is not the principal problem, I think. The principal problem is related to the two additional problems. That is that the COFOG does not consider multiple purposes or the impact associated with these expenditures, also what is generally referred to broadly as secondary purpose. So there are a number of activities outside the environmental division which have the major or the principal environmental concerns, and these are not classified, these are not tagged, these are not identified clearly. The most specific ones or the most clear ones are the clearest ones are within the economic division, which is forestation and energy infrastructure, which is the principal activities for climate change. However, those are not within the environmental division. They're actually outside the environmental division. I don't know, Michael, perhaps you didn't hear me. There was the message issue there. Is that correct?
Yeah, Rodrigo, we can hear you. I just wanted to inform that sometimes the audio is fading, so there seems to be a problem with the internet connection, but we can hear you. So please continue. Just that you're aware. Yeah.
So this is the second problem I referred to. And the third problem, which is not as clear, but is also very relevant, is that the structure, the conceptual structure behind the COFOG is a classifications of the purposes of expenditures in the sense of ex ante, what the expenditure is seeking to resolve, but it's not classifying expenditures in terms of the reason behind some expenditures. This is something that in the 90s was referred to as defensive expenditures, but is not classified in the COFOG and cannot be classified according to the current structure because of the nature of this conceptual approach. So here we're referring to risk reduction, emergency losses and damages, and identifying the causes or the reason behind those expenditures. To give you an example here, having an expenditure to build a bridge would be classified under classification, the economic classification, infrastructure, economic, number 4, but it's very relevant for governments to know if the bridge fell down because of a climate-related hazard or the bridge fell down because of a war or for other reasons. So this information will probably be essential as we move ahead into the post-2030 world and with increasing environmental hazards. So the last 2 problems, 2 and 3, are essential to be resolved. Given this reality, as I've said, there are a number of global and national initiatives for climate-related and environmental-related budget tagging. And these have a major problems. They are not comparable. They generate all sorts of confusions in terms of the type of definitions, not only the definitions themselves. And essentially, they have developed, I would argue, an ecosystem that is generating all sorts of problems in the statistical world. However, as I said, budget tagging is increasing. It's increasing because governments and the public sector are hiring this type of information. So therefore, we're facing a dilemma. And the dilemma is whether we can develop classification systems that are consistent with the government's concerns, or we can develop budget tagging which can achieve a statistical standard. So therefore, what we are suggesting is that perhaps having an integrated approach and being able to resolve this by converging the concerns that have been presented, discovered, budget tagging concerns, and also making the current purpose classifications a little bit more flexible. And we saw with much interest and with much positive interest the Eurostat proposal of policy areas as a way of bridging this flexibility. And we think that a similar approach might be needed as we move ahead with other purpose classifications. So what this integrated approach might suggest is update the structure of the classification to meet these user needs, make more granular breakdowns, use the current methodological and compilation guidance of statistical systems, but also recognize that we need to develop a structure in which we formally recognize primary and secondary purpose expenditures. And to do that, what we were thinking about is something that we're calling the extended COFOG matrix, or we can call this as policy areas. Here in the diagram, you see the different divisions of the current COFOG structure. We can extend this, if we think about this, as ex-ante environmental activities and tagging mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity across the different COFOG structures and categories, maybe even extending that to ex-post defensive expenditures through emergency relief and recovery investment. So we would have, as well as the current classification of outside the environmental protection division, a sort of a double tagging, but a consistent and coherent, harmonized double tagging system in which the secondary purpose environmental expenditures identified either for secondary impact or additional impacts or for other purposes are classified. So what that would mean then is that we would require a new classification structure for the primary purpose, environmental protection, but also a classification of the tagging of across the different divisions, which could be considered tagged environmental. The final classification then would identify clearly total primary and secondary expenditure. This would allow us to have some form of classification and identifying or tracking of environmental expenditure in this kind of division, in which the clear, exhaustive, and exclusive expenditure would be only primary expenditure, therefore maintaining the standards of the classification systems. But in a sort of a satellite or a policy area approach, we can identify additional expenditures that could be secondary expenditures in red, or eventually some other types of impacts in green. This structure would make coherent the current budget tagging efforts, but also maintain the classification structures and their coherence, because primary expenditures would maintain the principle of exhaustive and exclusive expenditures. This approach, and this is what we wish to bring to the table with the COFOG review, would require first developing a new environmental division classification structure based on these new environmental concerns. Secondly, we would have to recognize the need to establish guidelines for tagging efforts to converge into a common integrated structure. This could be done. Positive list of climate activities following perhaps current proposals like the EU taxonomy, and therefore require countries to have a double tagging and a double reporting approach to their climate expenditures. And also perhaps, if we may be so bold, as to develop a global recommendation on this classification approach through, for example, the GFF, the Government Financial Statistic Manual of the IMF, that could provide, for example, an annex with a recommendation of how to approach this, or with other current manuals. Eventually, this could also become a thematic account, as is proposed through the SEEA. So this is what we've been working on, and we welcome your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Very interesting presentation. I'd like to take the opportunity to move to the next speaker and welcome Banimati from the IMF, who will share their thoughts and ideas about the ongoing G20 Data Gaps Initiative. You're very welcome, Banimati.
Thank you, Nils. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to be part of this discussion. Thank you so much for UNECE and OECD to consider this presentation here. My work is actually simpler now with all of the background presentations and to references to the Data Gaps Initiative by Ilaria and Sven earlier in the conference. But in this presentation, I would just give you an overview of what we are attempting to capture under the session titled Climate Change Expenditures as part of the Data Gaps Initiative. To give you a recap, the Data Gaps Initiative was started in 2009 after the global financial crisis, when the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors they had a consensus that policy relevant data gaps need to be given high priority, and countries must start investing on producing the numbers as relevant to these policy gaps. After the first phase of the Data Gaps Initiative, which concluded in 2015, we had the second phase, which concluded in 2021. And now we have the third phase, which is which talks about climate change, household distribution, fintech and financial inclusion, as also access to private sources of data and administrative data and data sharing. This was accepted in the fall of 2022, and a complete work plan was agreed to by all the countries and international organizations part of this group. Now, given the range of topics that are really heavy, we have constituted task teams for organizing the work around each of the recommendations and to come up with the work plans. The objective of the task teams is to utilize all the existing methodological frameworks and guidance, and to facilitate the compilation of data required by the targets. So in essence, all of the discussions around the statistical classifications like the COFOG, SEP that we heard earlier, all of these, and also all of the other relevant classifications like the SNE or the SEEA Central Framework, would need to be considered by these task teams while coming up with the guidance around each of these recommendations. The idea here is to not just utilize all of the existing data sets so that there is a minimal burden on the countries to respond to these recommendations, but also to help them compile and disseminate data in a fashion that can help comparability across countries. We do hope to engage, and we have already started actually engaging with all the relevant stakeholders for each of these recommendations. With this background, I'll now revert to two of the recommendations that are relevant for this session on climate change expenditures. Recommendation 6 of the Data Gaps Initiative talks about government climate impacting subsidies, and recommendation 7 is about climate change mitigation and adaptation, both current and capital expenditures. So what are the targets for recommendation 6? In recommendation 6, we are requesting countries to develop and disseminate general government and central government climate impacting subsidies, which includes both climate sustaining subsidies and climate damaging subsidies, in % of government expenditure and within 12 months of the reference period. We are requesting countries to compile estimates, annual estimates for the years 2015 onwards. The complete structure of the Data Gaps Initiative is to recognize that there are differences across countries in terms of their statistical capacities, in terms of their levels of implementation of the different statistical frameworks. And therefore, under the Data Gaps Initiative, for each of the recommendations, there is a second best target also included in the work plan. The second best target requires countries for this recommendation 6 to develop and disseminate just the central government part of the climate impacting subsidies, again, including both the climate sustaining and climate damaging subsidies. And here the timeliness is also different. We're requesting them to release annual estimates within 12 months, within 18 months of the reference period, and for 2020 onwards. Under recommendation 7, the target is to develop and disseminate estimates of both climate change mitigation and adaptation, current and capital expenditures. We would also like to have some kind of a typology of the expenditures so that we can compare like numbers to like. We do understand that the mitigation strategies would be different across countries. And if we do not have a typology of classes specified underneath, it may be difficult to compare the numbers. We're also requesting for information not just for the public sector, but we recognize that it is the private sector now which is stepping up to spend so much more on both climate change mitigation and adaptation. And therefore, we are requesting for a holistic view of the expenditure, requesting not just data for the government, but also for all the other sectors at a minimum for central government and for non-financial corporations. The second best target is similar, but here we are giving the countries an option to either respond to just climate change mitigation part or the climate change adaptation part, depending on their country priorities. The background for both of these recommendations, as also several other of the recommendations, is quite similar, that there are several key definitions which need to be formulated and a consensus arrived through discussion and consultation. We do recognize that there are several news updates coming up, which are relevant to be placed in the context of these recommendations. We would also look at the changes that are likely to happen in the future. For instance, there are certain, for instance, the COFOG issues paper, which already has certain information on what the way would be to go ahead, or the SEP that has recently been accepted. These are the standards that we would be aligning both the recommendations to. As I said earlier, we do have a recognition that there is a need to have a tiered approach and not really a one-size-fits-all kind of an approach for the countries to follow. Where in this initiative, it has been mentioned upfront that there is a flexibility to allow countries to compile and report on what is feasible and also as to what is most relevant for them. For certain countries, as Rodrigo and earlier Tirapong also mentioned, it might be the defensive expenditures which are very high, or the adaptation expenditures which are very high on their priority list rather than the mitigation part. So for those countries, we would allow the flexibility under the reporting template to report on the most important ones to start with, and then probably add on items as and when they're able to produce those estimates. To give you an example, for example, recommendation 6, this is the kind of template that has been drawn up while we are asking for annual central government and general government estimates within 12 months for both the primary and secondary purpose climate sustaining subsidies. But we also have a tier 2, which talks about only the primary purpose, reporting on only the primary purpose expenditures, because we understand that the exercise of budget tagging and putting in the resources to identify such expenditures may take a longer time frame beyond the Data Gaps Initiative work plan. I'd like to now sort of deep dive a bit more on the recommendation 7, which is on climate change mitigation and adaptation, current and capital expenditures. As I said, it's a sort of a first time that we are having such an exercise at an international level. Not to say that other international organizations have not worked on this, but to have a consensus across countries for a single definition of expenditures is quite tricky. Rodrigo also mentioned it earlier that climate budget tagging, for instance, has different connotation for different countries. There are different lines which are of more importance. So comparing numbers across countries becomes a bit tricky. We recognize that there is a need to have a consensus across countries on what do we decide as a climate change expenditure. Are these expenditures that are aimed at adapting and or mitigating climate change, or are they expenditures on activities which can help in mitigation and adaptation? I'd also like to take a reference of the presentation done earlier today by Miguel, where identifying the activities actually is easier rather than identifying the purpose in some cases, or even if you had to identify the purpose, leading it to the activity is also important. The secondary purpose concept that Rodrigo also mentioned also comes into play. So this is a very tricky subject on how do we come at a definition that's agreeable to all, but we are working on it with the support of all the G20 economies and the international organizations. There is also a very difficult discussion here around the scope of these expenditures. What is it that we are planning to cover under the current and capital expenditures? As of now, we are proposing to cover capital expenditures as equivalent to the capital formation in the national accounts, and current expenditure as equivalent to the non-capital uses in the national accounts other than exports. But then these are some initial definitions or terms that we have placed up front in the concept note, but these are likely to have several iterations before we have an agreed discussion, agreed terminology. We have prepared concept notes for both of the recommendations. I think I missed mentioning that earlier. In that, we have given this type of classes that we could consider under each of these expenditures. As I said earlier, giving a typology helps us compare similar numbers across countries. So what is it that countries are investing on renewable energy is not a question that we can answer if we give just one line of climate change mitigation expenditures. So we have provided in the concept note an illustrative set of classes depending on the classification of environmental purposes, and is also an earlier work done by Eurostat. But I would not miss out on re-emphasizing this fact that all of these are in draft stages, and we are working with the countries to come up with more firmer sets that are acceptable to all. Similarly, in the adaptation expenditures, we are as of now preferring to identify expenditures by the type of risks that they are tuned to. So for floods, we would look at setting up of infrastructure that has been made as resistant to floods, or which can reduce the risk due to floods. But again, this would involve certain identification issues because not all kinds of construction activity can be clearly delineated under each of these classes. So we may have to understand that how do we get to those numbers which can best inform to us about the adaptation expenditures in the country. So referring back to Miguel's presentation, one way for us is to just identify the activities and be agnostic to the purpose, saying that the activity is relevant for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So let's just capture that. Another way would also be, of course, to look at the purpose, but not every purpose has the same kind of activity, and so it might be difficult to get to the activity if we looked at only the purpose, and we may be missing out on some big ticket items. So we are still working on how best to link these expenditures. But in the concept note that we have given, we are trying to say that let's look at the activity and the products to come up with, let's assess them on the basis of their climate relevance, and let's capture at least those activities for which we know there is a sure shot linkage to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So the proposed approach is to compile a thematic account of all types of expenditures as pertaining to climate change mitigation and adaptation. We would like countries to look at the expenditures that are already embedded in their existing government finance statistics or national account statistics, or even environmental account statistics. We do feel that we need to have an economy-wide perspective, which can
If you could
help
begin
influence
to draw your presentation to a close, Banamati. Time is
yes.
expiring.
Yeah, sure. So this is the last one. We do have certain changes proposed, that is to keep up with all the updates that are coming up in the various organizations. So that's about it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Banamati. Very interesting to hear these different perspectives on issues. I'd like to go over to a country example now and welcome Statistics Netherlands and the second presentation from Sjoerd in today's session.
Yes, thanks, Niels. Yes, well, let me first say that thanks for the opportunity to present this work today that we've been doing on, in this case, climate mitigation expenditure and particularly in investments. Let me also say that it's work in progress. This is work that we've been doing in the past years, primarily driven by domestic policy demand. There was as yet not a legal obligation for this, but as you may know, this is rapidly going to change as these climate mitigation investments will also by delegated act in Europe become part of the legal base for environmental accounts. So I will talk a little bit about policy and data needs, also from the Netherlands perspective, then talk about the scope and definitions with regard to climate mitigation investments. I will talk about the data sources and methods that we have used in the Netherlands, then show you some results and end up with some conclusions. So first, policy needs for climate-related expenditures. Well, in the previous presentations, we've already heard a lot of these data demands. So on this slide, I focused a bit on the perspective from the Netherlands that we see also in at the Statistics Netherlands. Well, what we see with regard to these expenditures, that there's quite a demand for to have data on the size and distribution of costs and benefits for households, companies, and distribution. So this climate transition, energy transition, is of course a heavy burden for our society, and there's particularly need for data. Well, who is going to pay for this transition? Is it households, companies, the government? So there's a real demand for data there. Of course, there's also quite a lot of interest what the government is doing, what we call here the government climate account, which is basically to have a lot of data about subsidies, taxes, which is also, of course, related to who is going to pay and who is going to receive the money. And finally, what that I've noted down here is, of course, there's quite a lot of demand for climate-related investments. Because investments often, of course, are the link between, on the one hand, policies for climate and energy, and on the other hand, reducing emissions and reducing energy use. Investments are the linking pin here that the policies can be achieved by doing these investments. Well, there are a lot of statistical data needs. Well, the previous presentation, the Data Gaps Initiative has already been introduced, and as already just mentioned, a quite recent development is that that probably the climate mitigation investments will become part of the legal base in Europe. So on the international level, there are quite a lot of data needs, but also on a national level, there are several data needs in this regard. We have the so-called National Energy Plan that's being set up. And it requires all kinds of physical and monetary indicators. And so our Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Change is particularly looking for indicators, also monetary indicators on investments. And they're also requesting this kind of data for us. And in fact, they want quite detailed data that we're now also looking if we can provide. And of course, data on investments are input for all kinds of scenario analysis and policy evaluation, also in the Netherlands. Now let me talk a bit about definitions and the scope. What are we talking about? Well, of course, we're talking about investments, so gross capital formation. So of course, the first step is that we want to be consistent with the definitions that are in the national accounts that are written here. So in principle, we're looking at investments that are already in the system of national accounts. Then, of course, we have to look at, well, what is the scope with regard to climate mitigation, climate adaptation. So in principle, there are several definitions out here. Also in the previous presentation by Banamati, she also gave some definitions for climate mitigation expenditure and climate adaptation expenditure. So that's the starting point. And for the rest of my presentation, I will focus on climate mitigation. Well, then of course the scope, the primary purpose, secondary purpose. Well, one way to look at this is to look at the so-called specific products and cleaner and resource efficient goods as they have been defined in the SEEA Center framework and also by the work by Eurostat on the integrated framework for monetary accounts. So what I've done here is translated the general definitions for these products and goods to the case of climate mitigation. And in this case, then we have a definition that reads like, on the one hand, we have capital goods that have been specifically produced, designed, and manufactured for the purpose of reducing greenhouse gas emissions or lowering greenhouse gas atmosphere concentration. So that are the specific goods and related investments. And secondary, we have the cleaner and resource efficient goods, which are capital goods whose primary use is not an environmental one, but that emit less greenhouse gas emissions when produced or used than equivalent normal goods, which have the same usage and provides equivalent service. So this is a starting point to look which investments are in scope with regard to climate mitigation. Secondly, we can look specifically what capital mitigation expenditure consists of, and this comes also directly from the SEEA Central Framework and also the EPA handbook that's provided by Eurostat. So first, we then have capital expenditure on mitigation products. So for example, the purchase of solar panels, insulation material, etc. And secondly, also very important, we have capital expenditure incurred for mitigation production activities. For example, some characteristic activities that we can identify for mitigation, such as renewable energy production or energy saving activities. So all investments that are for these activities should be then included within the scope. Finally, of course, we can look at the classification of environmental purposes that's now around, and particularly also what was also presented on the first day by Eurostat, the link that has been made between the SEP and climate mitigation. Well, this comes directly from that document. So first of all, there are the primary activities, and we can now make the link to investments. So investments related to the reduction and control of greenhouse gases, energy of renewable sources, energy saving, and also related R&D. So I think that's a good starting point to identify the investments that are within scope. So these are the primary activities. We've also, of course, to look at some secondary activities, and here there's still some discussion, I think, going on. Well, what to include and how to include. So, for example, capital investments related to reforestation, but also protection against forest fires. And also I have added here, that was not on the original list, reduction of the intake of fossil fuels for non-energy users. That may also be considered. So that's, we may also want to include investments there, not in scope of the classification of environmental purposes, and SEEA are some also, and these are also some discussion points. Namely, for example, public transport as a clear example. Well, on the one hand, you could discuss, well, say that, well, it should be included, but there are also some arguments against it, particularly if public transport is still based on fossil fuel consumption. So this is, particularly this list, I think, should be discussed further if it should be in scope or not. Now let me move on to some of the data sources, method, and the results for the Netherlands. Well, when you want to compile data on these investments, there are quite a number of data sources that you could consider. First starting point, of course, is data from the national accounts or of investment statistics. But of course, often the problem is that it's not detailed enough when you want to identify climate mitigation related investments. So what we've also looked at is data from energy statistics and price statistics, so physical data, and in combination with price statistics, you can also calculate investments. So for example, we have quite good information about solar panels, how many solar panels are being installed each year. We know the average price, so that allows us to calculate investment on solar panels. Third data source that we use is data on subsidies and related transfers. And a lot of these subsidies have to do with investments. So also that's a way to use this subsidy data and then calculate the related investments. And of course, there are also some specific surveys that we can use. We do not have specific surveys for this purpose, but still there are some surveys that provide information here. Well, of course, there are still a lot of methodological issues around. First of all, of course, you need to use multiple data sources. That's our experience. Existing classification systems often do not suffice. Well, we have had the COFOG discussion already, but also CPC. It's very hard to use that to really look at climate mitigation capital investments. Then there's the issue of the cleaner and resource efficient goods. So in principle, you should only include the extra costs here. That's the recommendation from SEEA. But how do we do that? And also what we see is often policymakers are not very interested in this extra cost calculation. They just want to see the whole investment. So that's also something we are struggling with. Well, adaptation investments we have not yet included, but also there's a definition problem there. And eventually, of course, well, we have now compiled data on investment, but eventually, of course, you want to integrate all this data into an accounting framework, as described in the SEEA Center framework. So that's, of course, then an additional step that has to be taken. Now let me turn to our results. And let me first say, well, the scope that we have now investigated is not yet comprehensive. So for the moment, we focused on investments in renewable energy and investments in isolation energy efficiency. So these are also the more easy bits, I must say, but still, I think this is the majority of climate mitigation investments we've now in our view, and we can provide data on. So how does this look like? These are the total mitigation investments that are in our current scope, in current prices. And as you can see, for the Netherlands, it has increased quite a bit, particularly since 2017. There's a large increase in the number of investments that we record. And these are also primarily related to renewable energy. There's a real energy transition going on, and that we can really then monitor in this way. Also, of course, interesting to see how this relates to the total investments that you can see in this this slide. As you can see, this percentage has gone up from around 4% to around 7%. So also with regard to total investments, climate mitigation investments become more and more important. So in that regard, also more important for our economy. What we also did, we have also some more detailed information. We can, in this case, for renewable energy, we can see, well, where are these investments made? And as you can see, there's for biomass, we do not see a real increase in investment, but for example, for solar, wind, and particularly heat pumps, the last years, there's a huge increase in investment in heat pumps. So also this kind of detailed information is very useful for our policymakers. In effect, they want even more detailed information here. And so our struggle is also, can we provide it, and is it available in our source data? What we did a couple of years ago is that we also, of course, want to allocate it to sector. And this is results for 2019. And in fact, quite maybe also a bit surprising is that households and services are the main investors here. You would maybe expect manufacturing or energy production, but we see that households particularly invest a lot in energy saving, of course, but also in renewable energy, the solar panels. And this is, of course, also because we have allocated, in this case, investment directly to households and not allocated it to, for example, energy production, as could also be done based on the SNA guidelines, but we chose to really allocate this to the household sector. In fact, well, this we want to improve on this also this year, so we are going to repeat this calculation the coming year. But of course, we're still missing some investments, climate related, that we're hopefully going to investigate this year. So there are investments in so-called CCS, so carbon capture and storage. It's for Netherlands, it's still small, but there are a lot of plans ongoing, so it's becoming much bigger in the near future. So we also want to take that into account. There are investments related to reduction to other greenhouse gases that we have not yet captured. And finally, a big one is the investment in electrification, including electric vehicles. But here we have to look at the extra cost criterion, how we're going to deal with that. So my final slide, some conclusions. We see a high demand for this kind of expenditures, in particular also investments from our policymakers. And also when we look at the data, we see that indeed also these investments are becoming more and more important. There are several scope issues that we still have to deal with, what to include, what to exclude. And the key methodological issues is this extra cost calculation. And finally, of course, adaptation investments, that is a new challenge. And hopefully we also will work on that in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you, Sjoerd. Very interesting to hear a country example and very good timing as well. We're moving forward with another country to present their thoughts on How to Account for Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation. And I welcome to the floor Julie Haas, representing the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis. Welcome.
Thank you very much. How do I change my slides?
With the clicker.
Splendid. Thank you. So in the United States, we've trying to think a little bit about climate change mitigation and adaptation expenditures. And we are trying to decide what is in and out before we start to try and find this. So at the moment, I want to update you on our thinking. And then later this spring, I'll be doing more of the operational identification of what we're going to be including and how. The BEA has quite a number of different thematic accounts, or special topics as we call them. These are supplementary statistics that allow in-depth analysis of special topics. These topics are quite often identified by requests from policymakers or from Congress. And then we have a methodology that's used for using the extensive supply and use tables that the US has internal to the BEA in order to develop these. We've got a number, for example, marine economy, outdoor recreation, travel and tourism. And as you can think, yes, these all overlap. So how do we get an overall picture? Well, we don't. They're separate, they're standalone accounts. We're hoping to start to add some of the SEEA monetary accounts to these. And if you were trying to put them together, as the puzzle at the bottom shows, things would be overlapping. There would be missing pieces. So we don't have the SEEA accounts. We have these other satellite accounts. So from what we've heard today, from Sjoerd, Bonamani, others, I think there's kind of two ways of looking at this. We can use established criteria that we are used to thinking and using in the statistical system. For us, it would be our starting point as the environmental protection expenditure and resource management, which has now come into the single classification of environmental, it's not products, it's purposes. I got to get my head updated here. Or we can take this more thematic approach, which adds a lot of flexibility, is very much based on experts, and is a bit outside of what we're doing with the SEEA work. I'd like to provide an example from my previous employer, Statistics Norway, who is publishing a subset of what was SEPA Category 1 that when I was working on this in my previous life, we took the SEPA 1 and divided it out between the climate gases and the other, so it was the greenhouse gases and the rest of the story for air pollution. And with that, obtained expenditure data for mitigation of greenhouse gases. So do we have a start towards mitigation expenditures? Yes, we do have a start. We also have a start in the SEEA manual as one of the research agenda items. Climate change, mitigation, and adaptations are specifically named in the manual. So yes, we don't have to start from zero. We have a starting point in SEEA. There's a lot of work being done in this topic. This is not an exhaustive list. It's an example. And we've heard from the IMF today. We've had some information from the OECD. Eurostat is also doing some work. They have both the new regulation for that is going to focus on climate change mitigation investment, but they've also had a project done which and some estimates made as a project for expenditures. So we also have some work from Eurostat that we can start to use. Are there internationally agreed upon definitions of climate change mitigation and adaptation expenditures? In other words, what do we include and exclude? What's in and out? And the answer to this question is no. That's where we are today. And I think it's good that some of us are starting to experiment a bit on the countryside to see what we can do. I put up the recommendations from the IMF regarding their definitions. Again, because these are quite often definitions coming from policy folks, they're very much looking at impacts. That's not the main purpose criterion that we're used to using. So this is a little challenging. I just am bringing up the SEEA main purpose or primary purpose definitions so we all remember them and see what they are. As Sjoerd and I believe it was the OECD also mentioned that we may need to expand these a little bit. But impacts is something we can find out through analysis. It's not something we can find out as a criterion for deciding if something is in and out. In fact, you need our statistics in order to make the analysis, in order to determine the impacts. We don't have causality. When you're doing a budget analysis, you do not have causality. There's no way. You might be able to have intentions, you might be able to think that this is going to happen, but you don't really know. So in 25 years of making statistics, I can find one example where I know that this policy was implemented and the change in the NOx emissions went down. Otherwise, you don't see these changes. They're such small changes in the statistics, you can't say it's causality. And we can't use that as a decision criteria. That's my perspective. So when we're going forward in the States, we're going to be using the primary purpose as a starting point, as the Netherlands has done. And we're starting with the definitions of the IPCC, with mitigation and adaptation. I'd like to just point out two things here. The IPCC definition of climate change has two aspects to it. There's human systems and human actions and their natural systems. So we've got two different aspects going on here. And the way we've been talking about what we in the SEEA are talking about is environment. But for climate change, we also have to have human systems involved. In other words, part of this is outside of what we're doing. So let's take a more specific look at stuff. We've got to start. We've got SEEA 1, protection of ambient air and climate. Technically, these expenditures would also include tradable permits and credits, would also include expenditures imposed by carbon taxes, and technically offsets. But I do think we need to be careful with the offsets because they're not always reliable. A lot of these we can find already. What we have not had in environmental protection expenditure mitigation definitions before are things to enhance the sinks, and that we find in the resource management expenditures. So these are actually a fairly big function of government, at least in the United States, with regards to land management, forest management, coastal area management, wetlands. This we find in government, and it's really hard to find it with the current COFOG. We need to go into other parts of the expenditures to find these kinds of government expenditures. I'm very much looking forward to changing COFOG and updating it from the 1990s and the perspective of environmental protection and get it up to today. We've got human systems and natural systems I've split up, and I've tried to then show that we have mitigation activities also in SEEA 10 to 16. But note that we also have some active actions that would be very difficult to separate, whether they're mitigation expenditures or adaptation expenditures. They're mixed. And then we have climate change adaptation activities that would increase natural system resilience and dealing with changes in environmental conditions. Now here comes the part that we're not used to dealing with. In the human systems, buildings, bridges, other types of infrastructure, we have adaptation expenditures. And this is what we're not used to having in the SEEA. So that's what we'd have to add in order to do, in my opinion, to make adaptation expenditures. Why am I making these diagrams? Because that's the way my head thinks. I like to have some pictures, and I like to try to think things through. Where would I find it? And then I'd go through and I'd try to find some examples of where those things would end up in my picture. So it's just the way my head works. It can be a helpful way of then discussing with others. In natural systems, we have process of adjustment to actual climate and its effects. That's the IPCC definition. These types of human interventions would be part of resource management expenditures related to natural systems. In human systems, a lot of these things are outside of the environmental protection expenditure and resource management because we're focused on the environment, not on the human environment. But there are nature-based solutions. Coastal areas, planting of mangroves or other wetland species can reduce threats of inundation. We've got climate smart agriculture, decreasing deforestation, terracing. These are human actions in the environment that makes that are found in resource management that are also climate related. I'm going to skip over a few examples. Go to the question of, is it only primary purpose, and what are we needing some baselines? Sjoerd brought this up in the Netherlands. Is it the expenditure of the whole big new bridge, or is it just the additional expenditures to make it higher and stronger? For electric vehicles, transportation is always a bit tricky. Main purpose, primary purpose is transportation. Electric vehicles can reduce emissions. If you're, in many cases, an electric vehicle, instead of you polluting, you're just transferring the emissions to the electrical production system. So it actually doesn't reduce emissions if you're getting your electricity from a coal-fired power plant. So is it just the battery that you would count for the electric vehicle? Would you include only the non-carbon producing electric portion of or production portion of your electricity? So you would take, if you've got 30% of your electricity production being made from non-carbon emitting or non-CO2 emitting production units, take 30% of your EVs, this kind of stuff that we need to try and decide how to include things, what's in and out, and how do we do it. So I would say there's two pathways to development. Those of us in the SEEA world think that we could use what we've got. There's no point in starting from zero and building something totally new. We could take what we have from SEEA, we're partway there, and use that as a foundation, but then we have to keep to the principles, which are primary purpose. Or do we simply make something up? And that's okay. In the States, we've made a number of things, these thematic accounts based on expert analysis of what's in and what's out. For the States, our next steps will be to further develop criteria for what to include and exclude, and I appreciate the work by Eurostat and the Netherlands for some good thinking, and then we'll be going through and examining products and services in our supply and use internal system and try to especially examine the construction and housing cost data to try and figure out some of the extra costs in building. And then we're going to have to do our own government budget analysis with some of the major resource management and disaster response agencies in order to find that government expenditure, since it's not in our COFOG. So that's news from across the pond, as we say. And happy to have your questions. Our emails are available if you don't get your answers today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julie. Moving on to cover further country examples, we're very happy to welcome Asset Nakibakov from the Committee on Statistics, Republic of Kazakhstan, who will present work about environmental expenditures accounts and its application in Kazakhstan. You're very welcome.
Спасибо большое, Нилс.
Thank you very much. I would like to share with you Kazakhstan's experience with the introduction of environmental expenditures accounts. As you can see on the slide, the methodological foundation for the introduction of environmental economic accounting is the one you see here, the central framework, and the Eurostat environmental protection expenditures account. I'll say a few words about the background to the introduction of this system in Kazakhstan. In 2015, 2017, we had a program financed by the World Bank, and within the framework of this project in 2015, we started introducing environmental accounts, and our partners for this was specifically the Statistics Office of Finland, in fact. And we are extremely grateful to them and express our thanks. Lilia Kaltova was our expert, and Tinu Mokinen, who helped us in the first steps in the introduction of these accounts. In 2017, subsequently, when we had already accumulated some data, we began a project that was a joint one, and in the framework of this project, we reached some conclusions and started publishing the first publications based on our accounts. The main source for data for creating these accounts are two surveys. The first was on 4 axes on environmental expenditures, and this is one we carry out every year. We have a Department of Statistics in the Ministry of the Environment, and it is this department which creates the data in this format. And then we have an annual survey which is on investment activities, and here it is capital investments for environmental protections that are followed. As I said, the EcoStat project with Finland assisted us in reviewing these accounts and to make sure that everything was in line with the SEPA system. We have the forms on expenditures and investment, thus that follow the SEPA principles. Here we have general information which I referred to. We have the 4OS survey. The periodicity is annual, and we collect data until the 15th of April. The same is with regard to our One Invest survey. Here you can see the classifiers which we use for economic activities. That's NACE. And you have Cato as well for administrative territorial objects. And then we have the reference book on environmental protection and resource management. When collecting data, as I said, we use the reference books from item code 1 to 9. That's from SEPA. And then we have the form on investments and expenditures. Beginning of last year, we have begun issuing an official bulletin, and until 2022 these publications came out, but they were more of an experimental nature. When we publish a new form of statistics, our publications are always experimental at a first stage, and then we receive feedback from our users. We receive feedback from academia and international organizations. We improve our publications based on that feedback, and now they come out officially. So you can see in 2023, we began issuing a bulletin on the accounts relating to environmental economic accounting. we have emissions, expenditures, and environmental taxes included in there. And at the same time, just in 2 months, we will add 3 additional accounts in our publications. That's forestry resources, mineral and energy resources, and material flows throughout the economy. And this is something that we're developing with UNEP. On this slide, you can see what the current expenditures for environmental protection look like since 2022. On the right side, they're disaggregated by environmental protection activities, and on the left, it's by SEEA. Here again on investments. And everything is brought together in an environmental protection expenditure account, which again is separated down into activities and other factors. Here we have a bit of statistics. Our data has been shaped since 2015. This covers 2015, 2022. If you look at the share in GDP is diminishing. In 2015, it was 0.63, and now it's 0.43 for 2022%. If you look at the share of EPE by SEEA, you can see that in all categories, the share is diminishing a little bit. Now, on the use of our accounts, we were very much surprised because when our first publication came out, we have a section on our site where we can monitor what publications are very much in demand from the site and how many unique users are downloading the publications. And we saw that there was a great demand for this publication. We knew that there was a demand for GDP, for example, but then right below that, there were the environmental accounts. And there were also the experimental accounts relating to health indicators. So health indicators and our health reports and our environmental reports are very much in demand. And since we began issuing these experimental publications, we saw that there was immediately an interest from the Ministry of the Environment, the various agencies, the Ministry for Water Resources, the Ministry for Agriculture, and, Economics, Finance, the Green Academy, and international organizations as well. On the next steps, as we saw in this seminar, there's a lot of work currently being done by international organizations on the SEEA and other frameworks. So we will have to adapt and update and change our classification system to bring it in line with these changes. So we will also be in communication with international organizations and local authorities. In our data, we don't have domestic households, so we would like to include households in our accounts as well in the future. And we also would like to include the series up to 2015 in our future publications, which we hadn't covered yet. We'd also like it to have it in constant prices. And we are looking with our colleagues who are experts in prices on how to correctly state the prices for the different years. We will also look at specific services, connected products, and adapted goods. And we'll have a breakdown of the data in that. And that is all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aset. It's very interesting to hear about the ongoing developments in different countries in UNECE and OECD. We now have, if I check the time, we now have approximately a quarter of an hour to take comments and questions from delegates. You're very welcome to raise your flags to pose comments or questions. I will collect questions, and then I will ask the various panelists to answer them. So the first I have on my list is from the European Commission.
Chair, and please bear with me because I'm going to revamp the question on nature-based solution I asked yesterday, because maybe the linkage with the circular economy is indirect, but the linkage with the climate change adaptation is there, as also shown by Julie in her presentation. So my question actually is to Sherd as a voice of UNST, and also to Rodrigo for OECD, and also to Banumati for IMF, in this revision of concept for COFOG and public environmental expenditure and data gaps initiatives, are you going to take into consideration the concept of nature-based solution? Because my feeling is that when you talk about expenditure, you mostly refer to human-produced assets, but actually when it's about nature-based solution, it's an ecological asset that provides many services, including coastal protection, flood control, all these services that are very relevant in terms of climate change adaptation, and not only also mitigation. So this is, it's going to be, I think, a concept that can make a difference, considering that this revision is taking place now. Thank you.
Thank you, European Commission. Next we have France. A quick question, please.
Thank you. I have a question about the COFOG revision process, because I didn't follow it strictly. Because you mentioned in your presentation the issue with a secondary purpose. So I was wondering, and it's also related to the presentation and suggestion by Rodrigo from OECD, whether there are plans to take the secondary purpose into account, and more generally, whether there are plans to have in the end, this is very ambitious, but to get a comprehensive category for environment, including renewable energy, resource management, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, France. Next we have Eurostat, and then I believe Russian Federation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all presenters. I have a question to Rodrigo from OECD regarding this grid budget tagging kind of classification, whether there is something, let's say, there is kind of a classification existing for this green budget tagging that could be used for this transversal, let's say, this second classification that you would like to propose on top of the COFOG. And then I have a question for Julia, Julie, sorry, for clarification. Could you give an example of this climate change expenditure related to human system? Because I think I didn't get it. And to Kazakhstan, you mentioned that you were you happily see that many users were downloading your data, and I was wondering if in your next steps you are going to visit those ministries and check with them, see with them whether there is something more that you could do or something different that you would have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Eurostat. Russian Federation.
Question will be in English. Oh, sorry, in Russian. Спасибо большое.
I would like to thank all the panelists that have spoken. They were very interesting presentations indeed. A question: as a next step, you said that you would use data on households. I think that would include macroeconomic indicators and the environment as well. Do you currently use statistics for the state sector, or is that also a plan that you have for future years? Thank you.
To whom was that question directed?
Asseto из Kazakhstan.
To Kazakhstan.
Thank you. We can begin to take those questions in hand. We'll take another question from North Macedonia.
I have a question also for the Kazakhstan. You said that the reporting units are the companies. My question refers to the size of the sample, or of how many companies do you include in the survey, and also one question for the COFO classification, because in our country, COFO classification is not in force yet, so we could not fulfill the table 1 for sector state. Is it the same situation as Kazakhstan, or you have data from COFOC? Thank you.
Okay, we will take some comments from our panelists now. The first question from the JRC was directed to Rodrigo and Sherd concerning nature-based solutions and their potential for incorporation in the COFOC. Sherd, can you offer us your thoughts?
Well, that's a good question. It's also an intriguing question. I think that should be worth considering, but in fact, of course, I do not know what will be on the issue list, but I think that's something we can indeed take into consideration. Of course, COFOG is the primary purpose, right? So in principle, it should be focused environment, but even if we include, for example, climate mitigation and all those areas. So in principle, it should link up with classification that we are going to revise. And we have to see if we can incorporate somewhere the nature-based solutions. I have my own feeling as well. It has to, of course, still to do with protection of the land, of nature, biodiversity. I think it's more in that area. So I'm not sure if there will be created a new category or subclass or whatever, but I think it's certainly worth considering. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherd. Rodrigo, online, can you share your thoughts about this, nature-based solutions?
Yes, so the OECD is participating in the task force on COFOG, but doesn't decide anything. It's going to make a proposal. So I think nature-based solutions is a good example of the type of new emerging policy instruments and policy approaches that have to be considered across these classification systems, and in particular COFOG. Otherwise, again, governments will go around the system through this budget tagging. So I certainly think it should be considered. I think it can be considered with this double tagging or approach. So in effect, an expenditure that instigates nature-based solution can therefore then be tagged according to multiple or different potential impacts it may have across the different environmental policy domains, such as mitigation, adaptation, and of course, biodiversity protection. So this is, I think, the principal task of COFOG is resolving these type of new policy or new emerging policy approaches in environmental field. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. I could stay with you to ask you to address the question from France about the incorporation of the potential for secondary purposes and your further thoughts about that, as well as examples from requested by Eurostat as to green budget tagging methods and principles that could be incorporated. I believe you're muted right now.
I'm sorry. So again, this is something that will be discussed in the course of the COFOG revision process. But I think, in effect, international organizations and countries are approaching a sort of a double tagging approach. And Eurostat has actually begun this through its proposal for policy areas within the set proposal. In effect, this is a double tagging approach, I would argue. Also, I believe France has a very extensive climate and environmental tagging approach, and their guidance here would be essential, because essentially what it's doing is identifying a number of new taxonomies and categories that are relevant for environmental policy expenditure approaches. So what I would argue is that the statistical community has to agree upon is a set of criteria for the double tagging that is consistent across these different concerns, and therefore allows budget tagging exercises through this double accounting or double tagging approach to be consistent. So a subset of clear, concise, and harmonized and comparable classifications for the double tagging that then can be used to compare across countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Do you have anything to add there, Shard, about the issues of secondary purpose and green budget tagging potentially?
Just that with regard to the COFOG revision, as far as I know, well, as I also explained in my presentation, the process is at the beginning at initial stage. So the task team is now formed, and then also the issue list will be formed. So, but I know these topics will be on the agenda there, and I assume they will also get a follow-up there.
Thank you, Shard and Rodrigo. Moving on with further questions from Eurostat. Julie, the question about climate change related expenditures related to human systems, if you could exemplify.
Yes, thank you. I think for mitigation, we're already quite aware of these types of technical solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You've got energy efficiencies, you've got other kinds of greenhouse gas emission, carbon capture, that kind of stuff is a human system that's influencing the emissions. I believe your question was probably more towards adaptation, is that right? Yes, okay. So what I kind of skipped over a little bit of this in my presentation. So we've got a lot of these have to do with buildings and infrastructure. So and we've got problems with the insurance industry. Your house gets flooded out every year, but the insurance industry will only pay out if you rebuild your house exactly in the same place. You may have the municipality saying, we don't want you to build there, then you don't get your payout. So we've got areas that are not going to be habitable. You've got coastlines that are washing away communities. You've got to relocate, especially some of the native populations living in Alaska. These kinds of adaptation expenditures are what I'm talking about. The human structures that we're either having to build to higher building requirements so they don't get influenced by more powerful storms, wind, rain, flooding, or infrastructure such as bridges that need to be higher, stronger, relocated because the river is becoming too wide at that location. It's this type of human systems that are needing the adaptation that are going to be substantial expenditures, and we're not used to looking at them with our environmental glasses. Does that help answer it? Great. Thank you.
In a pretty cool way.
Yeah.
I'll remember to bring props next time to my presentation. So the next questions were addressed to our colleague from Kazakhstan concerning the analysis of the users of the data, as well as different sources of data, households, data on state sector, about the COFOG, and about the size of the sample. So Asset, if you could share your thoughts.
Thank you very much. On the analysis of users, we are indeed conducting this work, and I can tell you how our work is organized in introducing the environmental economic accounting system. We have 3 working groups. One is on the introduction of SEEA, the other are the SDG indicators, and then the other on green growth, or the OECD systems. So these 3 working groups work together as well. Their work is connected. We have other users too, such as suppliers of information to the ministries and committees. We meet very frequently. It can be either quarterly or monthly meetings, and all these issues that arise are discussed at those meetings, and that includes the demands and needs of our users. We look at the current accounts that we're working on and those that we intend to address in the near future and those we're not yet able to. For example, over the next 2-3 months, as I've said, we will be adding additional accounts to our bulletins, and we are considering adding 4 more in the future. That's the flow of water, energy, and I forgot water, energy, and then 2 more environmental goods and services. Oh, waste. Yes, I'm sorry. So it's the waste flow accounts. This is something that we discussed yesterday, and we were not able to introduce these accounts yet because the waste accounts aren't balanced yet. We go to the Ministry of the Environment, and they have been telling us that there is the GPS tracking system that is now being very actively developed. So there's a GPS card and for the waste flow. So I think that we will be able to account for them better. We will be able to achieve a balance, and we will be able to establish the accounts. But for the time being, there are problems and it's still quite difficult. But as soon as we have the proper sources, we will be able to create those accounts more easily. So that was the first question. The second question was from the Russian Federation, asking about households. So our households are not included currently. We intend to include them. And in some other presentations, I saw that households were included.
Госсектор, какой там вопрос был? Что-то я немножко этот...
The state sector, did I miss your question? Russia, the question was on the state sector. I said that I saw that you were intending to include the household sector, but now are you including the state sector? Yes, the state sector is included. We conduct comparisons on expenditures from the state sector, for example, but for the time being, along the COFOG methodology, we only have the environment. The other 6 categories, unfortunately, are not disaggregated. So it's only at one level that we have that, and those are expenditures for the environment.
Okay, thank you for the questions and thank you for addressing them to our presenters. The time is 2 minutes past 12:30. I will hand over to my Scandinavian colleague or Nordic colleague here, Johanna.
Thank you, Niels, and also thank you for sharing, and thanks for all the speakers again. It was a very good session and really well on time also with quite full schedule, so thank you. And so now we will break for lunch for 2 hours. I think we have no announcements this time, which is, I think, historical. So So enjoy your lunch and let's be back sharp at 2:30 so we can continue with the afternoon program. Thank you.